Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 188, and I am the show's host, Kyle. On this show, I'm going to be discussing Israel and Iran. Of course, there's some long-standing tensions between these two countries. However, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu delivered a speech Monday night claiming to have proof that Iran was in violation of the nuclear agreement. This is really important news coming up. The relationship between Israel and Iran has a lot of impacts on how the conflicts in the rest of the Middle East go. Of course, Trump will have to recertify the sanctions waiver for Iran by the nuclear agreement by May 12th, or else the United States would be breaking the nuclear agreement. So this is a really significant issue, and if you want to share the show and help the show to grow, get the word out there, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or at libertarianinstitute.org, and you can find my news website at immersionnews.com. Alright, so let's talk about what this whole thing is. So we have the Iran nuclear deal. It goes by a couple of names, JCPOA, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the P5+1 nuclear agreement, Iran New Deal nuclear agreement, stuff like that. Whole bunch of different things that people call it. By this agreement, Iran exchanged making certain concessions and limitations and additional inspections on their civilian nuclear energy program in exchange to have sanction relief from the rest of the world. Russia, China, UK, France, Britain, and Germany all signed on to this agreement, and it was signed in 2015, and I think took effect in 2016. In the show notes page, I'll link to a show where I've really gotten into detail about everything in the Iran nuclear agreement, but in this show, I'm just going to be referencing kind of what came up per Netanyahu's speech. Now, Netanyahu's speech, he gives a speech, at least one version of the speech in English. I'm not sure, maybe he gave a second one, for an English-speaking audience, and then the other one for the Israeli audience. But from my take from the speech was it was directed at the United States, and more specifically Donald Trump. Netanyahu steps out in front of a big banner that says Iran lied. And leading up to this speech, because kind of what we get is Israel saying that, hey, Netanyahu's going to give a speech showing that Iran is in violation of the nuclear agreement. There's speculation that this means Iran has a secret nuclear weapons program that Israel's about to expose. And so there was a lot of hype pre-speech. Now, the other thing that happened pre-speech is everybody reverted or, tried to bring up all of the old times that Netanyahu lied, like when he said that the war on Iran and taking out Saddam Hussein would be a good thing. When he said time and time again that Iran was this close, very close, within a few months or a few years of making a nuclear weapon, and then it turned out not to be true. And so I think it's very important to frame that in that Netanyahu has lied to the United States in the past in order to destabilize one of his enemies in the region, and rather than use Israeli troops or Israeli money, use the United States to do so. In the speech, Netanyahu brought up some pictures and kind of gave the story of how Israel got these documents, which is, I think, is interesting, because usually the one thing countries like to hide is their methods of how they obtain the information. But Netanyahu was pretty honest about it. He says in 2016, they noticed that Iran had transferred their nuclear information to a warehouse in Tehran that looked a little run down. And so one night, the Israelis, I believe this was in 2018, January 2018, Mossad in Tehran was able to get to these documents and then smuggle them out of the country. Now, the first thing you have to ask here is that if this story is true, then man, they pretend that Iran is this giant monster that's a huge threat to the United States and Israel. And yet you had Israeli intelligence operating in the capital of Iran, and they were able to steal their nuclear documents and smuggle them out of the country. I mean, that's stealing the plans to the Death Star a little bit, And so there would have to be, I would think, some questions raised as to like how important this information really was to Iran if it was so easy for Israel to get. Now, during that presentation, he shows a lot of pictures. And from the analysis I've been able to read of the pictures, it seems that even the images of the site that Israel took the documents from, they're pictures from pre-2015. And then looking at the other images, this is information that was already known. Now, prior to 2003 and really post-1979, so in 1979 Iran, you had the Islamic Revolution, the Ayatollah takes over, and Iran changes from having a U.S. sock puppet as the dictator to having an opposing revisionist government in Iran. And of course, Iran's a large country. There's a lot of history there with the Persians, and there's a lot of wealth in Iran. There's a lot of energy below the surface there. Post-revolution, the United States took Saddam Hussein's side in the Iran-Iraq war during the 1980s, and that ended up Saddam using chemical weapons on the Iranian people as well as his own people. And then during this time into the 1990s and up until 2003, Iran had explored the possibility of pursuing a nuclear weapons program. Now, the IAEA report says that Iran didn't actually start trying to make a nuclear weapon, but rather explored, the cost, the logistics, the timeline to make a nuclear weapon. They start to dabble in the research and stuff. And while this is certainly means that at least some factions or some people in the country were looking at making nuclear weapons in Iran, this isn't like North Korea during the 2000s carrying out nuclear weapons tests and getting larger and larger bombs and better missiles. According to some of the analysis that I was able to read, that the actual weapons and missile diagrams shown really wouldn't be the kind of the route that Iran would pursue today just because of the increases in technology and whatnot. But as I was saying, the Iranian nuclear weapons program, as certified by the IAEA, was limited to just kind of exploring the possibility of having one. And so that was all the evidence that Netanyahu really gave. He didn't give anything that said, under this specific bunker, we have a test to show 90% enrichment, and these are some readouts on our seismic equipment that shows Iran is carrying out nuclear tests. Nothing like that. A lot of speculation. I'm seeing that pretty much everything that Israel has, that Benjamin Netanyahu has, was already turned over to the IAEA. Per the nuclear agreement, Iran turned over all their documents on their nuclear program to the IAEA, and that's how that IAEA was, I guess, able to issue that report. So I don't know what term would be most appropriate here as far as, what information Netanyahu seems to have, but it seems to be pretty much nothing. Nothing to show that Iran is actually in violation of the JCPOA. Nothing to show a secret nuclear weapons program. And at best, I think it's probably a stretch to say that Iran even lied to the IAEA, but maybe they did withhold a few documents. That seems to be like the only claim that's left that I can't really disprove at this point. Now, the U.S. reaction to this was really, really interesting. The first statement released, and this is the one that I immediately put up on Immersion News and was in my daily news roundup, said that the United States has known that Iran has a clandestine nuclear weapons program. And so this immediately sets off alarm bells. Is the United States has known for a while that Iran has had a secret nuclear weapons program. This seems really serious. And why didn't Trump bring this to the IAEA, prove that Iran was making nuclear weapons, and have the international community snap sanctions back on Iran per the nuclear deal? I mean, this could have easily happened. But it turns out that there was a revision, and there was a very important but very small typo, and that S at the end of has should be a D in had. And so even that statement isn't all correct, because as I was saying before, it sounded like Iran was undergoing nuclear testing in 2002. However, I guess Iran did have something of a secret nuclear weapons program, however limited it was to just exploring the possibility of making nuclear weapons. So I guess I'd like to do real quick what now on the nuclear agreement as we are within now the month of May. Countdown from the airing of this show, I guess we're about 10 days until Trump will either have to sign the agreement or be in violation of it. I mean, there's a lot of roads that could be taken here. Every other country in the world could say, we don't care what the United States says. Iran, the IAEA has certified 10 times now that you're within the agreement. We believe that you're in the agreement. And so the United States and Israel can, go to hell a little bit, and we're going to continue to trade with you. Could be that, it's kind of a mixed bag, a split result. Germany stays with trading with Iran, France and UK withdraw. Certainly, after Marcone's speech at Congress. And if you want to hear my take on that, really cool. I was on the Around the Empire podcast with Joanne Leone. I've been a long time listener to that show, so it was awesome to be on it. Me and Will Porter are the guests on episode 51, and we break down, kind of Marcone's visit to the U.S. And I'll include that link at the show notes page. But anyways, if you listen to my analysis there, it does seem that Marcone at least has plans. He's talks about creating this new world order and all this other multilateralism where we all work together against these opposing powers. So you would think that France would then go along with the U.S. on this. So it's up to Trump. Pompeo, now Secretary of State, unbelievable, says that the U.S. is unlikely to remain in the agreement past May. Before I think we put too much stock into that statement, we have to remember how off Trump and Tillerson were as far as the rhetoric goes and what they said. And it may be that Trump had used either, as a dupe or as an actor, Rex Tillerson to play a certain role as far as the negotiations go. It really wasn't always representing his own opinion or what he knew to be the truth. And so maybe Pompeo is saying this in order to get Iran to make some concessions. Now, what Iran has been saying all along is that we're absolutely not going to renegotiate the deal here. We signed the deal. We're following the deal. Let's all stay within the deal. And one of the reasons, it's very important to understand that one of the reasons Iran is doing this is because Iran made some huge concessions with signing the 2015 agreement. Iran poured concrete into their Arak reactor, which was their heavy water reactor, which produces nuclear waste that's much easier to enrich to weapons grade. Iran also destroyed more than half of their centrifuges. I'll have to look up the exact number again. But Iran made a huge number of concessions that aren't immediately resolvable tomorrow. And so while the sanctions could snap right back on, I guess there was an issue of the cash that Donald Trump likes to talk about. But that even then, it was just the United States giving Iran money that the International Court had ordered that the United States give to Iran because we stole it. But back to my original tangent, Trump could be looking not necessarily to get out of the agreement, but to have Pompeo make Iran believe that Trump is going to leave the agreement. That way Iran will accept a limitation on their missiles program or something like that. Now, Israel has been steadfastly against the nuclear agreement, and as Will Porter pointed out in the episode of Around the Empire we were on, the Israelis' biggest fear here is that Iran follows the nuclear agreement and tensions to thaw between the United States and Iran. Iran has a large population. There's a lot of trade to come from there. There's a lot of energy there. There could be very positive relations between the United States and Iran. Their civilian airplane fleet is old. And man, Boeing could make a ton of money selling to Iran. However, that would also mean that there's less need for the United States to have such an important relationship with Israel. If you look at the layout of the Middle East, with Iraq and Syria just struggling to hold their own country, Assad and the Shia in Iraq struggling to hold their own country from Sunni jihadists. Lebanon, while, Hezbollah is a military force that could repel an Israeli assault. Lebanon is a country that hangs on, kind of the possibility teetering on civil war. And so without Iran in the picture, there's really not a boogeyman in the Middle East that requires the United States to constantly be pampering Israel. And I think it really changes the narrative in the Middle East if Iran isn't an enemy. All right, so now let's get into Syria. Now, Israel has interest in Syria, and I think it's mostly just expanding their influence. There's a lot of this talk about Israel's goal in Syria is to actually take territory. And I haven't read anything yet that makes me firmly believe that that is true. However, I've read articles that certainly suggest it. I'll link to one in The Intercept that I found most compelling. That'll be in the show notes. However, a former Israeli official, Michael Oren, said that the Israeli position in Israel is to have everybody basically fight till the end. And so, they don't want a solution in Israel. They want it to be Israel doesn't want a solution in Syria. They want it to be a weakened state. I mean, Syria has been destroyed and is continuing to be destroyed every single day that the war goes on. And the longer that Assad has to meddle with the United States in eastern Syria and ISIS on the Israeli border and Al-Qaeda in the Idlib province, the longer that you could definitely assure Assad would never, ever be able to really challenge Israel in the Middle East. And so that it seems for the Israeli policy to be that they don't want Assad to win, and Iran has been helping Assad to win. Now, Iran's interest in Syria, Assad is an ally of Iran, but also the Islamic State, I mean, was an enemy of Iran. They wanted to attack the Shia, and Iran, I'm assuming, sees themselves a little bit of a protector of the Shia of the Middle East. And while Assad is an Alawite, which isn't quite the same thing as being a Shia or a Shiite Muslim, it tends to, for whatever reason, fall into the political orbit of the Shia, just like southern Lebanon. And also an Islamic caliphate that covered Iraq and Syria was going to be a problem and going to be a threat for Iran. And so I'm sure Iran saw, or at least the leadership of that country portrayed, that there's a whole lot of actual interest of Iranians in Iraq and Syria with the Islamic State being there. And I'm sure some of this is a little bit closer to home too, not something that anybody in the United States would really understand. But there's important shrines and monuments around the Middle East of various religious sects. And so there's some very important sites of kinds to Shia or Shiite Muslims in Iraq. And so for that reason, I'm sure there's plenty of Iranians that would love to travel there and visit those. However, ISIS has carried out suicide bombing against those sites. And so, these kind of things I'm sure are real problems for the people of Iran. Now, Israel has directly bombed Iranian targets, or sometimes what they label as Hezbollah targets in Iran, over 100 times. Most of these were very discreet. Israel never admitted to until somebody pretty high up, it may have been Netanyahu himself or just somebody high up in the Israeli government, said, yeah, we've bombed them over 100 times in Syria. But 3 recent attacks have been pretty large. The biggest one, I think, was after the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma on April 7th. On April 8th, Israel carried out an attack on the T4 air base and actually killed, I believe, an Iranian colonel who was high up in their drone program. Of course, you also had the airstrikes in Syria by Israel after the non-armed Iranian drone crossed into Israeli airspace, and Israel carried out massive attacks in Syria, and eventually an Israeli jet was shot down. And then Israel has also carried out the strikes, I believe they were on April 30th, the night of April 30th. And one of those strikes hit an Iranian weapons depot in Syria and caused a massive explosion. I believe it actually registered on, seismic activity as like a 0.2 earthquake or so. And up to 16 Iranians died in this attack. And so I think this is where the conflict between Iran and Israel right now is the hottest, is really in Syria, specifically in the Golan area of that country, as Assad forces continue to move towards taking territory from Al-Qaeda and ISIS that operate in that area near the border with Israel, and continue expect heated rhetoric against Iran, especially in the next 10 days leading up to the recertification of the nuclear agreement. Now, this is a much bigger issue, but also Iran takes exception, I think, more so than any other country in the Middle East. I even just saw that Mohammed bin Salman said that the Palestinians need to make peace. Iran really takes the side of the Palestinians and really opposes what they do to the people of Gaza and of the West Bank. As I've talked about a lot on this show, children are killed or have been killed at these protests by Israeli snipers. So, other news I wanted to touch on. Mike Pompeo says that he is urging Arab countries to resolve the dispute with Qatar. Of course, this has been kind of I think a geopolitical nightmare for the U.S. right now in the Middle East, because CENTCOM, U.S. Central Command, is located, along with our largest base in the Middle East, I believe about 10,000 troops, in the capital of Qatar. However, our larger, more powerful allies in the Middle East, the Emiratis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, currently have a blockade of Qatar and have cut off diplomatic ties with that country. And so Qatar has actually then drifted more into the orbit of both Turkey and Iran. And so I think as the United States maybe looks to prepare for some kind of attack on Iran, they're going to need to resolve any, if they're looking to do that, or even to carry out a more sophisticated clandestine operation against Iran, I think you're going to need the compliance of the Qataris. We got some good news though coming out of North Korea, and I want to talk about this real quick. North Korea has moved their time zone back to matching the time zone in South Korea. Now, the time zones were different because I guess to, increase the cultural problems. You can't call somebody at 2:30 if 2:30 is a different time. The leadership of North Korea had actually shifted the time zone a half hour off of that of South Korea. And so this has actually, I guess, turned out to be a kind of a diplomatic nightmare and a logistical nightmare as you try to schedule everything and somebody's time zone is a half hour off of somebody else's. I'm sure it's very confusing just because even if time zones are different, the minutes aren't. And so I know that if I'm talking and scheduling a podcast with somebody on the West Coast and I schedule it for 9 o'clock, they don't think it's 6:45, 5:45 or something like that. They know it's 6. And so it gets a little bit wonky whenever it's a half hour off, I suppose, especially when you're then trying to communicate the difference with Washington, who is several time zones away. South Korea is dismantling their propaganda speakers. They had shut them off before, but now they're turning them off. Trump talked about the location of a possible summit, or the summit that's planned between him and Kim Jong-un. He said that he wanted it to be in the DMZ or in the Peace Village there and not in a third country. I'm guessing he doesn't want anybody to encroach on his credit for this. And he did point out, and I think rightfully so, it would be, ceremonially important for it to be in that location. South Korean President Moon Jae-in was told, hey man, you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize for this whole thing. And he said, nah, Trump deserves that Peace Prize. Now, maybe Moon Jae-in actually believes Donald Trump deserves a Nobel Peace Prize for this because George Bush sent the bar so low on the situation with North Korea that the fact that Donald Trump hasn't scuttled this deal is such a miracle and is such a godsend that Moon Jae-in really believes that he deserves a Nobel Peace Prize. But I think more likely Moon Jae-in knows that this is politics and this is the way that this gets sold to Trump, is that you tell Donald Trump, hey man, you keep this up, you're getting a Nobel Peace Prize. I'm going to tell everybody you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize. That way, when you tell everybody you deserve a Nobel Peace Prize, you say, well, the Korean president said so. And so I think that this is really, to me, some of the most positive things I've seen as far as actually getting a peace deal done here is knowing that Moon Jae-in really understands how to, butter Trump's biscuit. All right, so I want to wrap up today by talking about something that's kind of just one of those things that really bothers me. And there's this idea or this kind of just myth that people who are non-interventionists, people who are anti-war, people who don't think it's a good idea for the United States to be bombing people in Afghanistan and Iraq and having troops on the ground in Syria and Niger, I think it's a really bad thing. And I don't think those troops should be there. I think the mission is stupid. I think it makes Americans less safe. I think it makes those troops less safe. I think it's a complete waste of money. However, I don't have any animosity towards the troops. I mean, I get it. I went to high school in the United States of America. I'm a NASCAR fan. I'm a football fan. Like, the militarism out there is thick, and I get why, these young kids grow up and they think, hey, I want to join the military because it's a really cool and it's a really important job. However, for those of us who question what they do on that job, you get hit with this, slander that you hate the people who are, you hate the troops. But it's so unfair because the people that make that claim really don't care about the troops either. I mean, if you look, I just read this story. There's a veteran who shows up to a VA facility and says, hey guys, I really need some help. And they say, sorry, come back later. And so he pulls a knife and says, I really need some help. And so they shot him and then threw him in jail. And so doesn't the politicians who have known about the problems with the VA for years and years and years, don't they have to answer to why they hate the troops? Not me. Because I didn't want him to be over there in the first place. I didn't want that kid to go over there and get injured, to get his leg blown off, to get PTSD. I mean, they're now finding that those shoulder-fired rockets are likely are giving our young men and women brain damage from firing them. I didn't want them to do any of that stuff in the first place. but yet there was a lot of people who did. And now those people say, well, you know, the budget's complicated. There's politics here. And it's like, no, you just don't care, right? That these people were expendable to you. And so, you know, as much as I don't believe in the mission, I do believe in caring for the victims of the missions by our politicians, you know, whether they be the innocent children that are maimed by U.S. bombs or, you know, the people who are put in positions on the other side of the war, on our side of the war, you know, our young men and women being killed and injured and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's just sad, but you know, the people who claim to care, the people who stand on the graves of the veterans the most are the least likely ones to help them, it seems. So, all right. Well, with that little rant, I'm wrap up the show for today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. I know that site down right now, but Scott Horton's, I'm sure, working on getting it back up. immersionnews.com for all the news you need to know. On Facebook at KYAAALE. Facebook, Libertarian Union. Libertarian Union is a great group of podcasts, guys. If you like the page, not only will you get my show, but you'll get a bunch of other really good shows coming in that feed. And then BitChute and YouTube is Immersion News. Thanks, everybody.